Welcome to the second of the talks on the Weimar Republic between 1919 and 1933. What we're going to be looking at over this talk, very briefly, is just looking at the impact of a certain German statesman called Gustav Stresemann, who was seen as one of the great statesmen of Germany. There is still some debate about this, and we'll be looking at that later on. Essentially, what we're looking at is the situation that created a great deal of the instability after the First World War, and then what sort of attempts were made by the German establishment to try and create a much more stable environment and essentially create what was known as the Golden Years. When we look at somebody like Gustav Stresemann, we can see that he is amazing person in terms of his trajectory. Coming from a lower class Berlin family, he is not part of the Junker aristocracy, and he is very much involved in trying to create a conservative liberal democracy in Germany. He is a founder member of the DVP, which was the centre-right party, and for a very short period was the Chancellor at the height of the inflation crisis, and then between 23 and 29 as the Foreign Minister in successive coalitions. And in 1926 he receives the Nobel Peace Prize. For many, he is seen as Weimar's greatest statesman, although again that is up for discussion. When we're looking at the situation in Germany, here we can see quite clearly the amount of land that Germany has lost as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. We can this goes through a list of the key elements of the Treaty of Versailles in terms of territorial losses, but also in terms of military confinement. You really need to have a look at these and make a note of them. This is a much more specific map of the territorial losses. What we can see is the main losses being towards the east, with the creation of Poland, and also the demilitarization of the west. Some land is lost to the north too, and that's an important point to make. And here we have one of the key articles of the treaty. The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed on them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. So in other words, this was the war guilt clause. Germany had to accept that they were the sole perpetrators of the war, and that all the damage and loss by the Allies is the full responsibility of Germany. As a result of this, we can quite clearly see what the Allied response of this was, which was basically for reparations. Once you've established the guilt, then you can punish. And this is a list of the key elements of that, leading towards, as we know, the 1923 hyperinflation. Before that, though, there was the occupation of the Ruhr because of Germany's inability to pay those reparations. And we can gain, it quite clearly goes through different phases. But what's interesting here is that the area known as the Rhineland was divided into 4 zones, each occupied by a different Allied army. And if you can look at the map there, you can quite clearly see that there are the areas that have been taken over by the British, the USA, the French, and Belgium. In a sense, this was done again in 1945, but that's a separate issue. Opposition to the Treaty of Versailles was about the only issue in which most Germans would agree during the Weimar period, whether you are socialist to some mainly, liberal or conservative or extreme right. There was the feeling that they somehow were being punished for losing, not necessarily for committing what the Treaty of Versailles said, but for simply losing the war. and so that they felt that they had to do something about this. Some felt that any concession should be avoided to the Allies. Reparations should not be paid, disarmament flat, and territorial clauses overturned. Others, moderates, recognised that Germany's domestic instability and diplomatic isolation hampered freedom of movement in foreign policy. In other words, they didn't have much movement and wiggle room, if you like, and so therefore had to acquiesce to what the Allies wanted. And there was a feeling that if through this, an attempt to fulfil as many of the clauses of the treaty as possible in the hope that this display of goodwill would encourage the Allies to grant further concessions. This was known as Erfüllungspolitik, or fulfilment policy. There were attempts by Germany to try and isolate itself from this, not isolate itself, but bring about an end to this isolation. And the beginnings of that was the Treaty of Rapallo with the Soviet Union, who again was another country that was seen in isolation because of its communist regime. There were secret clauses in the treaty which allowed Germany to circumvent the military clauses of the Treaty of Versailles by training troops developing forbidden weapons on Russian soil. This was the beginnings, as I say, of the end of Germany's isolation, but also, to some extent, you could see the subverting of the Treaty of Versailles. And again, this goes through the documentation of the Ruhr crisis of 23-24. As a result of that, which is what you need to look at on this sheet, as a result of this, you need to look at what the final part, which is the Dawes Plan, which was an attempt by at least to give some concessions to Germany, not to alter the total sum to be repaid, but drew up a more realistic repayment programme and provided a large American loan, and this is key to help finance Germany's economic recovery. In other words, America gave money to Germany so that it could give money in terms of reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France had war loans which they owed to the United States, and with the money they got from the reparations, they could give that money back to America. So you had a virtuous circle, or so it seemed, as long as all three sections were doing well, especially America, the United States. Further treaties were made, and we can see this with the Locarno Treaty, which was an attempt to allay France's security concerns and free Germany and Britain from the burden of occupation. The International Conference at Locarno between the 5th and 16th November 25 led to a series of agreements. From this, Germany agreed to accept her western borders, which included the demilitarised Rhineland, and significantly there was no agreement over Germany's eastern frontiers. And this is what Gustav Stresemann, who was the key architect of these, said. Locarno is the achievement of lasting peace on the Rhine. Notice the key thing there is the Rhine, in other words, the West. Guaranteed by the formal renunciation of force by the two great neighbouring nations, and also by the commitment of other states to come to the aid of the victim of an act of aggression in violation of this treaty. It can and ought to be the basis for a general cooperative effort among these nations to spread peace wherever their material power and moral influence reach. Big words, and for a short time this worked. There was a rehabilitation of Germany, allowed to join the League of Nations. There was the Treaty of Berlin with the USSR, which reaffirmed the agreements of the Rapallo Treaty. Germany signs the Kellogg-Briand Pact, thereby renouncing the use of force and committing itself to disarmament. And finally, in 1929, significantly, and a key date there, the Young Plan, a revised scheme of repaying reparations. The Allies agreed to the evacuation of the Rhineland early. So these are great as long as I said to you before, the economy, that there is a great deal of stability around in the world. Of course, after 29, that becomes much more harder. So was he a good European? You can see on the two sides there. Well, certainly he was conciliatory towards France and Britain. He got Germany to join the League of Nations and gets the Nobel Peace Prize. However, he does put economic pressure on Poland. Germany, as an advocate of the rights of German minorities in Eastern Europe, in other words, he stood up for Germans in those places, wrote a letter to the Crown Prince, readjustment of the eastern borders and liberation of Germany from foreign domination, which was the key element of that letter, and of course the illegal military cooperation with the Soviet Union. Was he successful? Well, in terms of foreign policy, reparation payments now clear. There was American investment, the beginning of reconciliation with France and the integration into European politics, early withdrawal of French troops from the Ruhr and later from the Rhineland. No territorial revisions in the east, however. In terms of domestic policy, German public opinion violently against amount and length of the payments. He managed to have some effect on that through the Dawes plan and the Young plans. The German financial system dependent on American money, which was okay in the short term, as I said before, as long as America is stable, both financially and economically. Public opinion, Germany gained too little by renouncing claim to right Alsace-Lorraine, so some people saw him giving up too much there, and there would be effectively disappointment overall by 1929. Without doubt, constructive and successful foreign policy in longer term perspective, in short term perspective, was not supported by German public opinion, was not able to give additional legitimacy to the Weimar democracy. But Germany becomes a major cultural centre as a result of the money pouring into Germany, especially more specifically Berlin, in these so-called golden years, which is going to be the theme of the next talk. Thank you.